Hello, welcome back to the next installment of Narconon and Scientology Chronicles. I'm Lucas Catton. And for this story, I wanted to share something with you about how Narconon became a media juggernaut in the early 2000s, and specifically Narconon Arrowhead, but there was a trickle down effect for other parts of the network as well. And it was really a fascinating story in terms of the evolution of how it occurred. So I started working at Narconon of Oklahoma. I was then at Narconon Chilocco in north central Oklahoma at the old Chilocco Native American School in Newkirk, Oklahoma. And this was the end of 2000 that I was there. And in early 2001, end of 2000, early 2001, Gary Smith had shared some of the stuff. He was the executive director. There was a gentleman in charge of divisions 6A, 6B, and 6C, which on a Scientology organizing board, they call it Div 6. The divisions 6A, B, and C are like the public divisions, the outreach divisions that are responsible for all the external facing or outreach type activities. And so one of the things that they started doing is they were booking themselves as a nonprofit. They're doing some radio interviews here and there. They're calling up some local radio stations and saying, "Hey, we're a nonprofit. Do you want to talk to an addiction expert, and fill some of your nonprofit obligations?" And so every now and then there would be a radio show that would get booked, and that was the first time I wound up doing one was early 2001. And that's where I worked, was in the public divisions. And I started out in the drug education sector from establishing the drug education department and then moving up from there to where I was Derry's deputy, if you will. I was second in command for the three Division Sixes. And along this time, Derry had also put in a lot of effort into growing the internet, the website, growing the internet presence, building websites for Narconon Arrowhead. And there was a man named Lynn Devendorf who used to work for Oracle Software who was there working and building websites and teaching Derry how to build websites. And that's when I first started to learn how to build websites. This was, again, end of 2000 / early 2001. And a little side story with that, Lynn had actually copied a website that was pro-drug called Urban 75. And I think it's still up online, where stopaddiction.com, one of the earliest versions of that website, was Lynn had ripped off from Urban 75. He basically copied the page and then started doing small edits to make it look slightly different. But basically, if you looked at the two side by side, it was a copy of that. And then there were some later iterations where he had copied other websites. I think one was like AT&T or something. But that was sort of the early internet days there. And that's where a lot of these other types of unbranded referral sites started to come from as well. As you just buy a domain name, and then put a phone number on there and then have it ring in. So along that time, Derry figured out that we could send out these public service announcements, these recorded radio PSAs, and bought a CD and DVD duplicator machine. And this machine would burn CDs and DVDs at a high rate, X number per hour. We could do, a stack of 100, in an hour, let's say. And so we started recording our own PSAs, radio PSAs, and then mailing them out to radio stations across the country along with a little cover letter kind of thing, just hoping that they would air them and we could do it for cheap. So that started to grow. Well, then we moved to Arrowhead in the summer of 2001. And the grand opening, the budget was over $100,000 for just the grand opening of the facility. And as part of that budget, they brought in a couple guys from LA, a couple Scientologists named Mick and Chris. And they worked sometimes in television. And they had gotten a lot of footage of interviews of parents and former and current students, what they called them, the clients, the patients there, and some of the quote unquote experts that were there and things like that, a bunch of staff, etc. And they wound up putting together a 21-minute video explaining the program that was used as part of the registration pack or the information pack for people that would start to get sent out. And they put it on VHS tapes a lot. and send it out to people. They eventually put it up online as well, so where somebody could watch it online, but they also would burn DVDs of it. In that time period, there was also a girl named Heather, a woman named Heather, who used to work in television and said, television stations, they need PSAs as well because they have to air it. So why don't we call television stations, tell them we're a nonprofit drug rehabilitation program, we have a public service announcement to send to them who's their PSA director and what format do they prefer the tape in. So they found out that most stations preferred like a beta SP format, and we started ordering these higher end beta SP tapes from a duplication house in Tulsa. And we're meanwhile burning our own audio PSAs for radio stations and started calling up these TV stations. And there was a girl, another girl who worked in 6A who started calling up, and we just started getting these television PSAs airing at different parts of the country. And one night, the phone rang off the hook. Like the next morning, it was like, oh my gosh, something crazy is going on. It was early in the morning. Something crazy happened. And they said, well, people are saying they saw us on CNN. Is that true? And the girl, Erica was her name. She said, she's like, oh, well, yeah, but I sent it to the CNN in Atlanta. So, just that one. And she didn't know that CNN's worldwide headquarters was in Atlanta. So the PSA director of CNN wound up choosing Narconon Arrowhead's public service announcement to include that month. And it ran all month long. And we got, hundreds of calls that particular month just from CNN alone. Meanwhile, the internet presence continued to grow, and there was hundreds of calls a month coming in from internet. Meanwhile, more and more radio PSAs were airing. More and more radio shows were being done along the time. It went from just a few a week to we'd do these live interviews, and sometimes as many as 30 or 35 or even 40 interviews in a single week at radio stations throughout the country. And back then I was writing articles and sending out these press releases and sort of like op-ed pieces and other articles, addiction related stuff. And we would email them out to newspapers throughout the country. And we had a clipping service that would find these articles and clip them and send them back to us. And I think in 1 year, for example, we had like 25,000 column inches of positive press between little public service announcements that would run all the way to full articles that I wrote that we would send out that were getting tons of coverage. And again, small, potentially medium, but for the most part, these are like small newspapers, small radio stations, and then some network affiliates on the TV side. And the internet was blowing up to the point where we started getting calls just from everywhere. And between the internet and radio and television and newspaper and then these referral websites and things like that, it blew up. It really got out of hand to the point where there was like 1,300 inbound inquiries in a single week. 1,300 people, what they call reaches, 1,300 reaches in a single week, people finding out and looking for help and contacting Narconon Arrowhead in a single week. So this continued on for years, to the point where when we moved from Chilocco to Arrowhead, there was 100 students. By 2005, there was 250 students. So in 4 years, that was the amount of growth that occurred. And they were regularly doing that same year. I think they topped out around $12 million. So an average of $250,000 per week. Some weeks it would be up to 300,000. Some weeks it would be below 200,000. And at a peak, they did more than 500,000 in a single week. Fast forward a little bit from this giant juggernaut of a machine that was sending out just tons of things to media sources all throughout the country and getting a ton of coverage. We even made a special trip to CNN to see Brian, the kid who was the PSA director there, and we were on first CNN, and then he's like, well, you need another cut. So we'd get a different cut of the PSA and send it back to him again, and he'd slip it in again for another month. And then we got on, he said, well, I can't do, full CNN, but I'll get you on like headline news this week or this month. And then we wound up on the CNN Airport Network. And, as I started doing some traveling and going to DC and stuff for them back then, I started seeing our PSAs while waiting for my flight in any airport in the country. This was kind of a crazy thing to watch. 2006, things started to started to curb a little bit in their revenue. I was gone by then. They started to go down, and some of these things started to fall out as well. Like other places got internet savvy, and so there was more competition there. There was less work and effort and coverage happening in the newspaper, radio, and television, public service announcement, and that kind of stuff. And right before I left, we were also doing like live TV interviews in different markets: San Diego, San Antonio, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, just Little Rock and other parts of Texas, Laredo, et cetera, Amarillo, those kind of things. And we were getting so much stuff. Well, that tapered off. And by 2008, when the market crashed, people didn't have the kind of money. And mind you, that $12 million was all cash and credit. There was no insurance at the time. Narconon didn't accept insurance. Well, as their income crashed, they started to bill insurance, and they wound up billing fraudulently, and they got caught eventually, which I'll talk about in a second. There's a previous video about Narconon committing insurance fraud, but then there was the through that they wound up getting back up to that $12 million range in 2012 was their sort of tie for their highest year, and then their string of fatalities happened at their facility, and dozens of lawsuits against them, and a bunch of exposing press started to happen in 2012 and 2013, and they were on the national news in a negative way. So it was quite the turn from just a few years earlier of how much positive exposure they were getting to how much negative exposure they were getting. And of the peak of 250 or so students and $12 million a year down to where they are now, which is, and have been for years, since 2013 really, or 2014, 20 people maybe, a handful of staff, basically the church keeping them afloat because they're not making any money. But somehow they're still open. And there's, obviously we talked about the investigation into their violation of the Eliminating Kickbacks and Recovery Act. There's the insurance fraud investigations that they didn't finish panning out despite having confirmation of specific evidence. And there's audio floating around somewhere, I know some people have it, of a meeting that I had with, that was recorded by the insurance fraud investigators in the state of Oklahoma. That included people from there. It included people from the insurance fraud investigators of the state of Georgia. It included someone from the FBI. And we'll somehow get some pieces of that out at some point. But that was a story I want to share. Like it really exploded during those 4 years, especially, and that's how Narconon became a media juggernaut. And there's a lot of times that I wish that it were different. That all those efforts, because there was a lot of really great effort put into creating that. And if it had gone toward a program that was not trying to recruit people from Scientology or have falsified certifications or doing all these other nefarious activities, then it would have meant a lot more. But I think that doing the speaking out afterwards and testifying and things like that is part of why I did that, because I was part of the team that created their meteoric rise, if you will, and so I felt obligated to be part of the team to speak out against the things that I knew were wrong about it as well. And that's also why I'm continuing to share these videos. So if you have any comments or questions or anything like that, please hit them up in the video. I'll be happy to answer them. And if there's anything else, you can always reach me anytime at lucascatton.com. Until then, take care.